Several years ago, as I was preparing to board a plane and fly across the country, I happened to grab a news magazine off the stand, and then on the plane, I read an article in it containing a fairly strong and maybe surprising critique of the International Space Station. Now, as many of you know, I'm a huge Star Trek fan and a casual Star Wars fan, but in real life, actually, I'm not actually a huge real-life space guy. I never dreamed of being an astronaut, so I honestly didn't know much about the International Space Station before reading this magazine article. So what I discovered from this article is that when the idea of the International Space Station was originally conceived, it was meant to be revolutionary. In the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan claimed that the space station was going to be responsible for, quote, quantum leaps in scientific research. It was going to produce life-saving medicines that could only be manufactured in the zero gravity of space. It was going to multiply jobs and open up a new world of space commerce. It was going to usher in an era of international cooperation and world peace. Decades and about $200 billion later, we have seen no quantum leaps, no life-saving medications, no space commerce, and certainly no world peace. Not only has the International Space Station failed to live up to its promise, it has lost its reason for being. 2/3 of the resources now invested in the station are spent on maintenance and repair. In other words, instead of ushering in a new age of discovery, instead of being the vanguard of a revolution, its higher purpose has devolved to mere self-survival. The primary reason the station now exists is simply to continue to exist. The story of the International Space Station is a tautological tragedy and a cautionary tale for Unitarian Universalism and the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville. As a church, what is our reason for being? Perhaps another way of framing that question is, whom or what do we serve and why? If the answer to these questions is that we merely live to serve ourselves, to serve exclusively or even primarily our own needs and our own desires for the purpose of simply getting by, to barely subsist, to comfortably continue on as we always have been, if that's the answer to those questions, then please count me out. As a faith tradition, as a movement, and as a church, I believe we are facing a moment of truth because the world has changed, and so its needs have changed. And if we wish to truly serve this world rather than just ourselves, if we wish to serve a purpose greater than simply perpetuating our own survival and our own way of life, comfortable as it may be, if we wish to be useful, then we must change as well. Now, I've said this before, and I really liked it, so I'm going to say it again. I believe in evolution. And I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. Please don't misunderstand me. I don't mean, I believe evolution happened biologically and historically, which I certainly do. But that's not what I'm talking about in the context this morning. See, when I say I believe in evolution, I mean it like how Christians say, I believe in Jesus Christ. I don't just believe in the historical fact of evolution. I believe in and have accepted evolution as my Lord and Savior. I believe evolution is the path of salvation for all of us. And right now, the world is calling us to evolve, to transform. And that call is in no way meant to disparage where we have come from or our history. A call to evolution and transformation does not mean that who we were or even who we are is wrong. It just means that if we want to continue to be right, we've got to change with the times. We modern-day Unitarian Universalists, we find ourselves seated on the shoulders of giants: Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, Olympia Brown, Abigail Adams, Susan B. Anthony, Albert Schweitzer, and closer to home, UUCJ's most prominent minister, who notably and nobly led this congregation during the civil rights movement, the Reverend Charles McGee. We should rightfully appreciate the profound theological, ecclesiological, and humanitarian foundations that our forebears have laid for us. We have a rich history that we ought never to forget. But, to paraphrase Marshall Goldsmith, we must also recognize that what got us here will not get us there. And that very truth, that profound truth, was understood intimately by every single one of those individuals that I just named. Every one of those individuals were vanguards in their own right and in their own way. That's a common thread that ties all those names together, and it may be the common thread that defines this faith. We are, and always have been, a progressive faith, which simply means that we are always progressing. We will always be on the front lines of change. And if we ever find that we're not, then we're not doing this thing called Unitarian Universalism right. The future requires that we embrace our heritage and tradition of breaking with heritage and tradition. This is a theme that I want to explore over the course of this year. And one place that I think we as a people of faith need to recognize for a need for a cultural shift, a place where we need to see a need for self-transformation. It involves our historical reticence to claim and embrace our own power by sharing our own message. We UUs have had a historical tendency to hide our light under a bushel. That is to say, we don't evangelize. And I get it. Evangelize, that's kind of a loaded word, a bit of a nasty concept for a lot of us. You know, many of us came out of, or at least have personally had, negative experiences with various faith traditions that had a bit of a fundamentalist flavor to them. Religions that proselytize, that shove dogma down people's throats, that may have used fear or violence to compel us to conformity. We Unitarian Universalists, we pride ourselves on being a chosen faith, a faith chosen without coercive force. But by keeping our personal faith out of public sight, by tucking our church buildings into little enclaves of nature and wilderness far away from major thoroughfares, by failing to mention our faith explicitly in social, cultural, and political conversations in the public square, we have made it very hard for people to choose us because they don't know who we are or that we even exist. Many Americans, if they do know who we are at all, they do so only because they've heard the term Unitarian used occasionally as a punchline in a sitcom. Now, this past Thursday, I had the honor to once again participate in a Youth Leadership Jacksonville event. And at that event, I, along with clergy from many diverse faith traditions all across the city, we met over lunch with dozens of high school students who had been selected to participate in this amazing program. And of about 30 young people that I met on that day, of about 30, only 2 had ever heard of us. Do y'all know the story of the Shakers? The Shakers were a small sect of Christians who broke away from the Quakers about 200 years ago. And although the Shakers bear little in common theologically with Unitarian Universalists, there are some really interesting similarities and parallels between our traditions that might serve to make us want to examine the Shakers just a little more closely, perhaps reflect on whether they might serve as a cautionary tale for us. And I also definitely want to note that I am indebted to the late Jim Key, former UUA moderator, for these observations that I'm about to share with you. Mr. Key discussed this with us on a UUA Southern Region conference call years ago, and his insights on this matter have always stuck with me. So, the Shakers. The Shakers, like Unitarian Universalists, broke away from a much larger, more mainstream Christian tradition. Like UUs, Shakers were always a religious minority who often found themselves at odds with their larger society and culture. Like UUs, Shakers had some relatively liberal or progressive ideas in their day, such as gender equality and pacifism. Like early UUs, Shakers were associated with trying to establish utopian communities or communes. Like UUs, Shakers became rather insular in the practice of their faith. They were not particularly interested in evangelizing or inviting outsiders to join their faith or to enlarge themselves or their sphere of influence in the world. Instead, they were content to turn inwards, to focus on themselves and the private expression of their faith, which included living with intentional simplicity. Now, one important difference between UUs and Shakers is that Shakers also preached and practiced celibacy. I think we're all aware UUs ain't celibate, at least not voluntarily. Although Unitarian Universalists never adopted a doctrine of literal celibacy, we nevertheless did adopt a somewhat metaphoric doctrine of celibacy. For decades, we UUs had a philosophy of religious education that did not stress Unitarian Universalist identity formation or including our children as part of our greater community. We raised up our UU children to be incredibly open-minded and open-hearted, which is great. And because of our admirable dedication to teaching basic religious literacy, we also taught our UU kids all about the religions of the world, except maybe our own. And so when they grew to adulthood, many of our children left our faith to become, religiously speaking, something else or nothing else. We failed to effectively communicate to our own children why our Unitarian Universalist faith exists, why our churches need to exist, and how they, the children, are an integral part of our community. And so we lost many of them. So we may not have practiced literal celibacy like the Shakers, but we kind of ended up with the same result: no offspring. Today, there are only 2 remaining Shakers in the world. As a religious people, they will soon, quite literally, be extinct. If we UUs can't or won't convince our own children and young people of our own usefulness, and if we continue with this reticence to evangelize and bring in new members, then we UUs, to paraphrase Jim Key, we will go the way of the Shakers, except we will be forgotten even faster because at least the Shakers left behind good furniture. I don't want us to go the way of the Shakers. I don't want us to go the way of the International Space Station. And we don't have to. Like many UU churches, I think that we have a beauty and a power that we are simply afraid to embrace. And the fear of our own beauty and our own power, the fear of what it would mean, how it would change our lives and the way that we see the world if we were to actually understand what we are sitting on, that fear may have limited our vision. It may have diminished our ability to dream big. It may have blunted our sense of imagination. And And without that imagination, without that dream, without that vision, and without the hope that accompanies those things, instead of looking at the horizon, we look down at our feet. We allow our focus and our attention and our energy and our resources to be stolen by trivial matters of no lasting consequence whatsoever. Over and over again, we allow our hearts and minds to be ensnared by the mundane instead of elevated by the transcendent. But we are capable, individually and collectively, of so much more. We are like a bird walking on a path, taking steps on a long journey, fretting over fences and potholes, wondering and worrying how we will make it over them, forgetting that we have wings. We can fly. We need only unlock our own power. We cannot be afraid to be great and to do great things. We must not fear our own power. UUCJ, I think, is a sleeping lion, and it is about time for us to wake up. Not so that we can go and save the world. That's not it. That's not it at all. The world doesn't need us to save it. Like we saw in the play earlier this morning, we're not sent to be messiahs. See, the real truth is we need the world to save us. And if we serve the world, this world will transform and liberate us. The truth has always been that we need each other. As we serve each other, we transform each other. That is the salvific power of relationships and beloved community. So my call for us this morning is to spread our wings. It is time for us to grow. That's what you're investing in when you place your pledge into the big blue boat next Sunday. That's what you were investing in earlier this morning when you gave to the UUCJ Foundation. And that's what you'll be investing in when you donate to the upcoming Capital campaign. We have been hiding our light for far too long, and the days are dark. Right now, these are perhaps the darkest days that I have ever seen in my own life. So I believe it is time to let our love shine bright and fierce. Let us not be afraid to do great things together. Amen and blessed be.